Thank you, Marlene, for hosting and for that wonderful introduction. So just a bit of background to what I'm going to present today. Very much a work in progress, and it's really attempting to explore the connections between domestic aspects of China's government, particularly of Xinjiang, and the relationship to One Belt, One Road as a wider foreign policy strategy. So the starting point for the paper was really a piece by Francis Fukuyama early last year, where he spoke about One Belt, One Road as being unprecedented in Chinese foreign policy, in particular framing it as the export of a Chinese model of development to much of Eurasia. And in this context, he framed it as counterposed to US strategies, the so-called pivot to Asia, and also the Obama administration's 2011 New Silk Road initiative. However, the key problem that raised in my mind was this really left unresolved or underexplored how that practice of that model of development actually occurs in places such as Xinjiang, but also Tibet, and what this may or may not tell us about China's rise as a great power. Now, ethnic diversity in China, in a very broad sense, and particularly speaking from the discipline of international relations, has generally been overlooked in a lot of recent analysis. However, of course, as most of, I'm sure, people in the room are well aware, China's ethnic minorities, particularly in core frontier regions such as Xinjiang and Tibet, have played a very important political role in modern China's history. In particular related to the fact that key separatist challenges in these regions are defined by the geopolitical position of these regions, such as Xinjiang and Tibet, and also factors with respect to demography, and also to relative levels of acculturation of various ethnic minorities to the dominant Han Chinese culture. So with that in mind, really hoping to sketch out this afternoon a number of core arguments. First is that Beijing has gradually constructed a coherent strategy towards its ethnic minorities, particularly in what I've defined as its core Eurasian frontier regions of Xinjiang and Tibet. I'll mainly focus on Xinjiang, given my own particular interest in Xinjiang and the Uyghur. Core aspect of China's strategy here is to transform the Han relationship with ethnic minorities, and in particular to integrate and effectively build the state in these core frontier regions, particularly in Xinjiang, to overcome the historical aspect of geopolitical marginality or liminality of Xinjiang with respect to Han China. So in this sense, it's about remaking these core frontier zones to become conduits of Chinese power in some senses, so echoing in some respects Fukuyama's argument. So in this context, I'll also link this perhaps to an idea drawn from American political history, of course, of the idea of a frontier thesis that was popularised by Frederick Jackson Turner, of course, in the late 19th century, and hopefully I'll touch a little bit more about how I see the linkages in the Chinese case shortly. The second major argument is that Xi Jinping's One Belt, One Road strategy, which has very much become one of his signature foreign policy initiatives, is in some ways a direct outgrowth of previous domestic campaigns, particularly in Xinjiang and Tibet, related to economic development, such as the Great Western Development Strategy begun in 2000, and also wider foreign policy initiatives and rhetoric. In particular, throughout the 1990s, for instance, Xinjiang was often defined by Chinese policymakers as forming a Eurasian land bridge that would link China and countries to the West. So this is a very clear lineage culminating in the One Belt, One Road process. Finally, sort of overlapping all of this, is that much of the narrative of One Belt, One Road in the Chinese context, but also in a wider context, particularly in the West, is not unproblematic. It concerns particular issues or contradictions in domestic governance in Xinjiang, contradictions within China's security posture, particularly as it relates to the issue of Uyghur terrorism, and also more broadly geopolitical problems related to China's relations with other great powers, particularly the United States. So my starting point here is to look at, I suppose, this idea of bringing the frontiers back into the analysis of China's rise, again, particularly in the context of international relations scholarship on China's rise. There are two sort of main streams here, I think, in the IR literature regarding China's rise. One, very much associated with neo-realist paradigm, such as those such as John Mersheimer and so forth, Waltzian approaches to international relations, see China as simply yet another great power, and we should not expect it to act otherwise. Mersheimer has this wonderful quote in his 2001 book saying, "Why should we expect China to act any differently than the United States did in the late 19th century in carving out its special hegemonic role in the Western Hemisphere? Why should we expect China to do differently in areas abutting its own territory?" Another broad stream within the IR literature is what Jonathan Agnew has defined as ideographic understandings of China's rise. In this context, there are a number of substreams. One sees China as a unique historical actor, one that cannot be easily categorised in traditional IR, Western IR terms. Another, associated with David Kung, is to present China's rise and its various initiatives in the foreign policy context as an attempt to re-establish a John King Fairbank-like Chinese world order, to reconstitute that in the 21st century. Another is to view China as being culturally exceptional, and Henry Kissinger towed this particular line in his 2011 book, simply titled On China. What unites all of these, however, I think is what William Callaghan has defined as a new Sino-speak. And by this he means that much of this literature is, in some ways, perhaps implicitly and explicitly in others, is about naturalising what he terms Chinese hegemony for Western audiences. However, there's a number of key problems with both of these particular views. The China as yet another great power assumes the consolidation of the state. And this is particularly relevant to frontier regions such as Xinjiang and Tibet, which has been very much, the Chinese policy has been very much focused on traditional state building activities and also assimilation of ethnic minorities. The ideographic stream of literature, on the other hand, again presents China's rise in some senses as natural, or a return to some sense of normalcy or normal order, particularly in East Asia, and is largely benign, that it will not disrupt the status quo in strategic and security context. Both of these views, however, I think ignore the role of the frontier in shaping Beijing's foreign policy and also its vision of itself. The frontier in Chinese history, of course, has been very important, been construed as the edge of civilization, the steppe sown divide, and so forth. Very much about geopolitical liminality and the inability at times of China-based states to control or absorb those frontiers. Alexander Woodside has categorised this as a cyclical, catastrophic view of the frontier, whereby the frontier, when China-based states were weak, were perceived primarily as sources of threat. When China-based states did in fact expand and control these regions for various periods, they were often then construed as a drain on the empire when they were controlled by China-based states. And this is something that is particularly acute in late Qing debates about whether or not to attempt the reconquest of Xinjiang after the Yaqub-Beg rebellion in the 1860s. This cyclical, catastrophic view of the frontier, Woodside suggests, was reimagined in the 20th century by both the Kuomintang and also the Chinese Communist Party in their attempts to both claim the Qing inheritance, if you will, the Qing territorial inheritance as their own, and to have it viewed as legitimate by the international community. So in this particular view, Xinjiang, Tibet and other former Qing territories were viewed as errant territories that had to be returned to the motherland. Now, Woodside suggests that this is a linear providential conception of the frontier, whereby these frontiers are no longer conceived to be, for example, primarily sources of threat, nor drains on the ability of the power of the state. Rather, they can be turned to China's advantage. So, in the post-Deng period in particular, I think the linear providential view, as Woodside has it, that view has become ascendant in China. In particular, China, particularly with the Great Western Development Strategy launched by former President Jiang Zemin in 2000, China was perceived itself, in some respects, in the context of Xinjiang and Tibet, as a transformative force of civilization that would bring modernity and development to the undeveloped periphery. Here the focus was on redressing regional and inter-ethnic inequalities and also to link, in some respects in the official imagination, a link between socio-economic underdevelopment and inequality with dynamics of separatism and increasingly, in more recent times, terrorism. So the Great Western Development focused very heavily on a state-led economic development program for a variety of Western provinces, which, not surprisingly, were generally focused on regions such as Xinjiang and Tibet. The Great Western Development really highlighted the state-building process behind Beijing's approach here. I had a focus on large infrastructure developments, for instance, tying Xinjiang and Tibet much tighter to the Han Chinese core of the PRC, a focus on the integration of political, economic, social and even cultural integration of these regions and the peoples that inhabit it with the dominant Han Chinese culture. So in some ways, I'd agree here with, I think, Elena Barbatseva, who defines this as a developmentalist approach to China's ethnic minorities. Now, as sort of a footnote to this narrative, of course, despite the billions of dollars of investment directed at regions such as Xinjiang, there are still very clear elements of marginalisation of ethnic minority populations, such as Tibetans and Uyghurs, ranging across political, economic, cultural and demographic factors that I won't necessarily touch in on great detail here, but perhaps we can discuss some of it in the discussion period. What I'd like to focus on rather is some of the domestic implications and foreign policy implications of this developmentalist agenda that China has pursued. And the first series of implications stems from the linkage between economic modernisation and China's overall goal of integration to make, in fact, Xinjiang and Tibet integral provinces of the PRC, as China often claims in its official white papers, for instance, on Xinjiang, that it is an integral province. So it's about making good on this claim. In this context, the Great Western Development and also subsequently the One Belt, One Road strategy are about overcoming the geopolitical liminality of Xinjiang and Tibet. The problem for Beijing, however, is that Uyghur and Tibetan ethnic coherence, resilient religious and cultural identities pose or are perceived as posing obstacles to this process. So in some ways China is seeking to deliver modernity with Chinese characteristics, as Ildiko Balahan has phrased it. And the problem here is that this exacerbates in some senses Uyghur and Tibetan grievances, in fact long-standing grievances related to political, economic, cultural and demographic marginalisation. Of wider importance, I think, however, is the perception in China that underdevelopment is in fact a root cause, particularly of China's problem with Uyghur separatism and terrorism. And this really came to the fore after the 2008 Tibetan uprisings and also the Urumqi riots in July 2009, where there was high-level debate about the need to shift from a so-called first to second generation of ethnic minority policies. The first generation, so-called, of policies modelled on the Soviet practice, some claim had politicised and institutionalised ethnic identity and equality between ethnic groups. The so-called second generation of ethnic minority policies, however, should focus, it was argued, on equality between citizens rather than on ethnic groups. So this was in effect trying to take the ethnic out of ethnic minority policy. And James Leibold, a colleague in Australia, has defined this as an attempt to make ethnic minority policy ethnically blind. So development assistance should be delivered to areas that are underdeveloped. That should be the only criteria, not whether in fact they have ethnic minority populations. In terms of foreign policy implications, this is where I touch on Frederick Jackson Turner's concept of the frontier thesis. Of course, I'm sure most of you are well aware of Turner's argument here, where he suggests that the essential fact of American history was the advance of American settlement westward. The frontier was the meeting point between savagery and civilization. The recession of the frontier went hand in hand with the march of progress and modernity. Not surprisingly, in some senses, in a long-term historical view, that perception of the expansion of the frontier and expansion of progress also went hand in hand with the development of American imperialism and progressivism, particularly under the administrations of Theodore Roosevelt, for instance. How does this relate to the Chinese context? I think the developmentalist agenda, again in Barton Sager's phrase, in fact has informed crucially China's approach to its periphery, not simply frontier regions such as Xinjiang and Tibet, but those states beyond those boundaries in Central Asia and also South Asia, particularly through the development of narratives around new Silk Roads and also the One Belt, One Road narrative itself. So this again links back to Fukuyama's argument early in 2015 about One Belt, One Road being about the export of this developmentalist model to the rest of the world. And in some ways I think this links quite nicely with what Agnew termed the ideographic understandings of China's rise in international relations scholarship about naturalising an emergent Chinese hegemony on its peripheries. However, this sort of approach ignores a number of opportunities, dilemmas and contradictions for China's march west, particularly in this developmentalist model. Clearly there are a range of geopolitical opportunities for Beijing in this context. Firstly, in the post-Cold War period, there's been a reimagining of Xinjiang's geopolitical position and also its attributes, which very much mirrors Woodside's view of a shift between a cyclical, catastrophic view of the frontier and a linear, providential one. So Xinjiang, at least since the mid-1990s, has been construed officially in Beijing as, in a sense, as an attribute, as an advantage for China. It presents China with unique geopolitical qualities for it to pursue its power and interest beyond its borders. Another major factor in a geopolitical context, of course, is the relative decline of the United States and also Russia as actors in Central Asia, perhaps more so with respect to the United States than Russia. In this context as well, the Obama administration's pivot to Asia and the short-lived New Silk Road initiative were seen in Beijing as necessitating what Wang Jiechi termed China's necessity to march west as a response to the US pivot to Asia. So for Wang Jiechi, he suggested that it was necessary to secure Xinjiang and Tibet to ensure China's access to Eurasian trade and resources. Others, such as Li Yonghui, suggested that China's rise was in fact very much like the rise of the United States in the late 19th century. And interestingly here, he makes the comparison that Central Asia could in fact be seen as China's Latin America, a strategic supporting peripheral belt, a buffer, a platform and a channel for Chinese expansion. So these two Chinese scholars present in some ways One Belt, One Road as China's own pivot to Asia in response to the United States' pivot to Asia. Beyond the geopolitical aspects to One Belt, One Road, of course, I'm sure many of you would have already seen the various maps and so forth produced officially by Beijing and also by external observers, mapping the existing plans and initiatives encompassed by the One Belt, One Road. Crucial to these have been the development of geoeconomic corridors, for example, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar corridor, and so forth. Many of these have been construed in geopolitical terms as a way for Beijing to extricate itself from its so-called Malacca dilemma in the event of a conflict with the United States. However, the geopolitical readings of these particular corridors are not necessarily accurate in my view, as we have to consider that these are often coupled with various other Chinese institutional building initiatives. For example, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, development of the Silk Road Fund, for instance, which Xi Jinping has stated has got $46 billion earmarked for it. So in this context, this speaks to One Belt, One Road as a way to China to present itself as a provider rather than a free rider in the provision of global public goods. In this context, China becomes, the One Belt, One Road is about a China-centred hub of regulated Eurasian interconnectivity. However, this issue of Eurasian interconnectivity is, of course, not unproblematic. And one particular factor that I think demonstrates this most clearly is with respect to the issue of Uyghur separatism and terrorism. In the post-9/11 period, of course, China has done a lot officially to construct a particular narrative of the Uyghur terrorist threat, whereby Uyghurs are not only extremists aligned with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban and like, but also supported by a range of other so-called hostile external forces. Much of this narrative has been focused on a number of small groupings such as the East Turkestan Islamic Movement and more recently the Turkestan Islamic Party, which have been active in some senses in Afghanistan and Pakistan and also more recently in Syria. This has resulted more recently in Xi Jinping's announcement of a so-called People's War against terrorism in Xinjiang, which has in effect in many ways securitised ethnic identity in Xinjiang itself, resulting in the state doubling down on a range of repressive measures that are well known to most observers of Xinjiang in recent years, such as strike hard policies, increased monitoring of religious observance and so forth. So ultimately, China's One Belt, One Road understood in this context of a developmentalist strategy in Xinjiang itself, and combined with a number of the geopolitical imperatives in responding to either perceptions of US decline or Russian decline in Central Asia, or perceptions of an implicit American strategy to contain China in the Asia Pacific, combines a number of factors. We have issues to do with state-imposed modernisation, the role of ethnic identity and the centralising state in China itself. Whether in fact the results of this process will be intensification rather than modification of Uyghur and other ethnic minority resistance to the state. Finally, in the geopolitical context, we also have the issue of problematic narratives of the New Silk Road concept itself. So not just China has propagated a particular view of the Silk Road, there are also Indian accounts of the New Silk Road, Central Asian elements and so forth. Additionally, there was also non-state actors which have latched on to various aspects of the New Silk Road and this concept of Eurasian interconnectivity. Perhaps most problematic for China would be the development of potential linkages between Uyghur, a very small group of Uyghur radical Islamists with other movements in the region and also beyond into the Middle East. Finally, the issue of China's attempt to present itself as an alternative model for international cooperation is also quite interesting and also problematic for China. On one hand, we have the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, Silk Road Fund, and so forth, seen as being counterposed to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for instance, as a means of competitive regionalism, in which geopolitical competition between the United States and China is in fact factored into various multilateral regional organisations. So in this context, there's a return to competitive geopolitical blocs, in some senses reminiscent of the Cold War, but perhaps without the rigid ideological elements of the Cold War itself. So I might leave it there.